Welcome to the Homegrown podcast. I'm your host, Liz Hazelmeyer, along with my husband, Joey.
Good afternoon.
And together we hope to educate, inspire, and equip you in your pursuit of true nourishment. Today's guest is Christine Muldoon. Christine is a functional nutrition therapy practitioner and food educator for families. Her focus is to empower parents to shift their mindsets and inspire intentionality when parenting and feeding their children. I love that so much. Inspire intentionality. Christine, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back on, guys. It's good to be here.
The first episode we did together, we called it Picky Eating 101. And I will tell you, people ate that up, pun intended. They loved it because this is something that I think every parent faces at some point in their parenting journey. Is a kid resistant to eating food? And especially if you're on a real food journey of any kind, you know the pains of like, I want you to be healthy and eat nourishing food, but also like, I understand you don't want the scrambled egg. I don't know what to do here. You're at a crossroads. So we're going to be reiterating some of those points that we talked about in the first show. I still think if you haven't listened to that show, go back and listen to it because Christine says so many golden nuggets of just like beautiful wisdom to help you in your own parenting journey. But also this episode, I'm excited to go more granular and talk about what you do in your own home. Give us a window, a peek inside behind the scenes. But let's start out with, before we get into any of that, how you became so interested in picky eating and how you came to a point where you were speaking about it in a public setting.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I have always been fascinated with babies and feeding kids. And when my first was born, it was part of the reason why I was so excited for kids. It was like one of the aspects that was most interesting to me, placing food in front of my oldest, who was a boy, and just watching him play around with it and figure out what to do with it. And I was never really the type of parent who was afraid of either gagging or choking or fearful at all. Like I was not fearful when it comes to food at all. I was more of just like, he was my little experiment, like, oh, what can I give him and what will he eat? And with each subsequent child, I have found that passion for like feeding young kids growing, and just the relationship aspect, everything that surrounds it, I find fascinating, the psychology behind it. It's so interesting to me. And I think that that's one of if we get it right, and we're not all going to get it right. Okay. So, there's, there's a lot of opportunities for error, but when we really focus on it, it creates such a wonderful opportunity for health and nourishment and relationship building. And it's really, it's crazy to think, but humans have to eat 3 times a day, minimum maybe 2 times a day. Okay. But we are the only species that comes together to eat 3 times a day. There's, tons of different types of animals out there. There's some that only have to eat once a month. But what is it about humans that we have to eat 3 times a day? And that's what makes me think like there's so much more than just the food aspect to this. There's a reason why it was designed that way, why we are coming together 2 to 3 times a day to nourish ourselves. It's more than just food. So that's a little bit of like why I'm so interested in it and why I have made it sort of my niche to talk about feeding kids and picky eating.
I love that. And my little active listening here was that when you're intentionally investing time into your kids' eating habits, you're going to watch that grow, right? And you were saying, hey, it's not going to be perfect, but wow, but investing that time, it's always going to get better, right? If you're intentionally setting a goal of, I want to improve the way my kid's eating. And it just hit me this term that we as parents, and it'd be interesting, Christine, if you experience this as well, and all the people listening to this, if you've heard this, because I feel like this can be a very destructive, but like almost like get out of jail free card kind of term. And that's, well, they'll grow out of it, right? I can't tell you how often I've talked to parents and, so-and-so's a picky eater. He doesn't like this, but he'll grow out of it, right? And I'll tell you what, I've fallen victim to that too, where I've hoped that one of my kids would grow out of something eating wise, right? An
Yeah.
eating habit of some form. And 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later, it's like, maybe we have to start introducing this thing and kind of breaking through some of those barriers intentionally. But anyhow, I love what you said. I totally agree. And anything else, Elizabeth?
I agree that feeding your kids and your family is so much more than just the food. I love that you kind of started with that and you led with that, because I think sometimes people get so stressed about the ingredient list and they forget about how their own nervous system is functioning, and they stress themselves out while they're cooking dinner, and then they sit down to have a stressed out dinner with their kids, and that alone is communicating a specific language to our kids about food that they're picking up just subtly. Then you don't even know it. And so having this kind of holistic approach to feeding your children, nourishing your kids, both through the ingredients you're using, but also how that food relationship plays out, how you're modeling food as their parent. It's all beautiful and it's all synced together. So I love that. I'm curious, where were you with your firstborn on your real food journey? How far into your journey were you, and how aware or awakened were you to the idea of nutrient dense foods?
Oh, yeah. That's a fun story because I was definitely not very, very aware.
Hmm.
I at that point in my life, I was starting to look at ingredients and I was starting to pay attention to the ingredients in the foods that I was eating, but I was not eating ancestrally and I didn't know anything about the Weston A. Price Foundation or any of that. It was more of, oh, if this food has more than 5 ingredients, I'm not going to eat it.
Mm.
And I fell like fully into the I'm doing baby led weaning 100%. That's all that I'm going to do with him. And so for me, baby led weaning was all encompassing of every single food. Like I did not restrict anything. And there's videos of my firstborn at like 2 years old eating donuts from Stan's Donuts, which, is a place in Chicago. But and they're really cute videos, don't get me wrong. Um, but I didn't think at that point that those donuts with all the sugar and the sprinkles on them and that kind of thing were maybe not the best food to be feeding a 2-year-old, especially a 2-year-old. And the irony of this is he's now 10, and every year for the past like 4 years, he's asked me for donuts for his birthday as like his special treat. And he only wants homemade donuts. He's asked me to make them for him. So like 4 years in a row now, I've made donuts from scratch for him. And it never occurred to me that maybe that started when he was 2 years old when I was feeding him donuts then. But my other two, I was way more conscious and much more intentional about the ingredients and what I was feeding them. And those kids were started out on egg yolk, liver, sardines, bone marrow,
Rock
all those,
stars.
all those types of food. But this is maybe a little long-winded answer to your question. My oldest is an incredible eater. Such a good eater. I mean, we'll eat pretty much anything you put in front of him. There's a few things that are non-negotiable for him, but for the most part, he's very and he loves food. Like he's, very motivated by food and interested in it and all those things. So
That's such an encouragement, though, to those of us who also had kids who, like, maybe we were new in our real food journey. Like, your kids have so much room to grow. Also, kids are allowed to have food preferences. You're allowed to, even adults are allowed to have food preferences. I mean, Joey doesn't love mushrooms, but
I love mushrooms.
See, it's such a love or hate. The extent to which picky eating is plaguing young children, I think, is quite the pain point that most parents are feeling. But that's different than a food preference, right? So that's really important to note. But I do want to dig into the whole concept of baby-led weaning, because I think with parents who are trying to take an intentional approach to feeding, that's their first stop, is they hear this thing, baby-led weaning, and there's a lot of nuance around it. But I'd love for you to help us define what baby-led weaning is, because I know Joey's going to ask because he has no idea what this is.
I had wrote it down.
But then I want to talk about, as you mentioned, some of the pitfalls that can happen with that, which are all foods are encompassed. There's no real hierarchy of nutrient density at a specific stage or age. So talk to us about what baby-led weaning is as a practice.
Yeah. So it's so funny. I'm going to like disclaimer this with saying that for those that are familiar with Sally Fallon Morell and her work, she is 100% against baby-led weaning. She's very outspoken about it. She hates it with a passion, like capital H. And this is where I think we both differ, because I think that it's a fabulous tool for creating strength in the mouth, working on oral motor skills, working on the lateralization of the tongue, like things like that. But like you said, Liz, I don't think it's the one and only way to feed a baby. And just to back up a little bit, you're right, Joey. So baby-led weaning is a form of feeding babies in which, as they're weaning off of nursing, you introduce solids. And the idea is that you only give them solid foods in their whole forms, not mashed up or pureed or like no fork mashables or anything like that. So, for example, if you've got a piece of bread, you're just going to like cut the piece of bread in a really long strip, hand it to baby, and baby's going to grab it and just sort of like gum on it. And the same thing would be for like a raw carrot or a raw piece of celery. Like you're giving a 6 or 7 month old a raw carrot, raw celery to just gnaw on. And so that's the idea behind baby-led weaning, that all foods and any foods are good to feed your child, and the bigger pieces and the more the better. And also the idea that they're self-feeding. So that's the other difference between, let's say, like a puree model, which is where you have a spoon and you're spoon feeding baby, versus baby-led weaning is they are grabbing what's on their tray or on their plate and they are feeding themselves any which way they want. So it's really messy too, obviously, because they're doing it themselves. But one of the issues, and I completely agree with this, one of the issues that Sally has with it is that number one, it's messy. So that can be a deterrent for some families if they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to clean up this mess. And to that, I say, get a dog. No, I'm kidding. Maybe don't get the dog, but no, you can use like a mat under the high chair, and that's a little bit easier to clean up. The other issue with it is in the baby-led weaning book, as you mentioned, Liz, there is no hierarchy of nutrient dense foods. It's just like anything goes. So you could feed a 6-month-old a raw carrot stick, which is not something that I would recommend at all. Not only can a baby not break down, digest, and absorb a raw carrot, but you're not pairing the raw carrot with a fat, which will help the baby absorb those nutrients even more, those, the vitamins in it. You can give a baby cooked vegetables, but I personally would not recommend any raw vegetables until after about like 12 months or so. It's just baby's digestive system is too immature. But anyway, and then the other issue is some of the very nutrient dense foods like egg yolk and liver and bone marrow and broth, those aren't really foods that you can pick up and eat yourself. Unless maybe you're giving baby like broth gummies. Those are just a little bit harder to self-feed. So those are foods that need to be spoon-fed. You can spoon-feed broth or put it in a bottle. You can spoon-feed egg yolk. You can spoon-feed liver puree. So that's why I think that exclusive baby-led weaning is maybe not the best route. You can do a combination of both, and I think that works better.
Is the main point of the philosophy to give the child autonomy in their feeding?
Yeah.
That's why they don't want to spoon feed? Like, what is it? Is it something against literally physically putting food in their mouth? Like, you want to see the baby choose the amount and what they're eating?
Yeah, totally. The main point is autonomy, that the baby, and there, again, there's truth to this. The baby experiences eating in a fuller way when they are picking it up themselves, they're feeling it with their fingers, they're like smearing it on their face, they're putting it in their mouth, they're saying, how much can I fit into my mouth? And then often gagging, because they're like, oh, that was too much, so out it goes. And then maybe picking up a smaller piece and putting it in their mouth. All of that. And there is research showing that babies who mostly follow baby-led weaning have lower instances of gagging the older they get. That gag reflex does integrate quicker if a baby has those opportunities to practice independently versus a baby that's exclusively spoon-fed and doesn't really ever have the opportunity to put more food in their mouth and see what happens if you put too much food in your mouth. Then it takes longer for that reflex to integrate. The research just shows that those babies have higher incidences of choking than a baby that has at least had a chance to practice on their own.
That's fascinating. It reminds me of the startle reflex, and a reason why we stopped swaddling with arms in is because the longer you suppress that by tucking arms in a tight swaddle, the longer it takes for babies to grow out of that startle reflex and wake themselves up. It's almost like if you let them live with their natural instinctual reflexes, they'll mature out of them faster. How funny is that?
Yeah.
The thing I think is, I can totally see both sides of this conversation, is one, building in, like you said, the autonomy of the baby and giving them the opportunity to work through that reflex is super cool. And I agree with you that I do think you can do that with having a traditional food focus. So something I did was I mashed up softly boiled egg yolk with butter and made it kind of this like thick consistency and like rolled it in a little ball. And I would just stick these balls on the high tray, on the high chair.
Yeah.
And Ray would just like pick it up with her two little fingers and practice her dexterity, and she would choose how much she would eat, but it was still that nutrient dense kind of Sally Fallon approved diet. Now, I was still spoon feeding some things, or like banana is really easy for kids to digest. You can slice that up. They can put that in. So I think having a more blended approach and also knowing the why behind the foods that you're choosing. I want to get into that for a second here too. I also think the pitfall of baby-led weaning, as you have also talked about, is like they're going to eat whatever parent is eating. And if your parent, if you as the parent haven't dialed in your food choices, now you're putting yourself in a huge learning curve where you have to really quickly figure out, okay, what's healthy for me and what's healthy for baby. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that say, I never cared about the food I ate until I had to start feeding my kids and realized I saw it on their plate. And I was like, oh gosh, that's probably not what we should be feeding these growing kids. Beautiful reality check there. So I think for the dialed in parent who can understand, I want to feed my kids the best whole nutrient foods, what's a good list of foods to start with, whether they want to do baby-led weaning or spoon feeding? What are some of your go-tos for first foods for babe?
Yes. Okay, so some of my favorites are egg yolk. Just the egg yolk. Fry yourself an egg, add a little bit of salt to it. You can even take raw liver and grate a little bit of liver on top. That's like, a nutrient bomb right there. Definitely liver as well. And there's different ways to prepare it. You could fry it up in butter or lard or tallow, cut it into long strips, and then just hand it to baby and have them sort of, what they do at that age is like suck it. They're just like sucking all of the nutrients out of it essentially. You could mash up the liver. You can add breast milk to it to make like a form of pate. You could add, again, lard or butter to it, make sort of like a thicker, coarser pate. So liver, egg yolk, broth, because babies' digestive systems, they're born with essentially leaky gut. And as their digestive system matures, it heals and seals. And so if you are feeding baby broth and meat stocks specifically, then those are very healing to the gut. And you can do that in a bottle. I fed my kids broth in a bottle. I just felt like it was easiest. So a little bit of broth, salt to it, and they would just drink it like it was milk. If baby doesn't take bottle, then spoon feed it to them. And you can also add broth to lots of different foods if you feel like it's too difficult to spoon feed such a thin liquid. So you can add broth to your liver. You can add broth to cooked veggies. Then the other one would be bone marrow. Bone marrow is a powerhouse just because it's an immune booster and it's super high in fat, and the brain is, what is it, like 95% of the brain is fat or something. I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's an insane amount. And so we definitely want to be feeding our baby very high fat foods. In fact, little of a side note, babies are born ketogenic. Like they are naturally ketogenic because mother's breast milk is so high in fat that the ratio between fat and protein and carbs, babies are essentially keto, until we start introducing other foods to them and, carbs and stuff, and then they get off of it. But that is what they are designed to stay at. Okay, so bone marrow. A really fun way to do bone marrow would be you roast the bones, you put it in a mixer, you take all the liquid and the marrow, so including like the greasy fat on the tray, you put that along with the marrow into a stand mixer, you whip it, and it turns this beautiful white, thick consistency, almost like marshmallowy. I'm loving your face, Liz. This is cracking me up. And you can add a little bit of salt to it. And then it's like thick enough to where you can put it in a bowl, put a spoon with it, and it will stick to the spoon. So baby can actually practice eating with a spoon with bone marrow, and it won't like really slide off. That is a fabulous way to feed bone marrow to kids. And then the last one would be ferments. And again, we need to build that gut microbiome. So ferments are really important, and ferments can be something easy, like you just take the sauerkraut juice and pour a little bit over the liver that you're serving, or the soup that you're serving, or the vegetables, or just feed a spoonful of the sauerkraut juice. You don't need much. It's just a tiny amount, just so that they're also getting used to that sour-ish, tangy flavor profile and gut benefits, obviously. And then in addition to that, fat, lots of fat. So butter, lard, all of those things are so necessary for their development. Any animal protein, fish, sardines are great. A lot of people like to start with sardines. Lamb. I say pretty much all animal proteins. And if you can focus on animal proteins, broth, and fat, you're pretty good to go.
That's great. What's on your list of do not feed your, let's say, 6 to 12-month-old?
Yeah, I feel strongly against sugar. Really any sort of sweetener. And I feel about this way up to 2. So even a natural sweetener. I just don't think that babies need it. And the way their palates are primed, a fruit is sweet enough for them. So any form of either natural sugar, obviously we're not supposed to be giving babies honey before 1, but any natural sweetener before 2, I don't recommend it. And any refined sugar, obviously, also before 2, don't recommend it. Because the longer you can hold off on that, then the better it will be for your kids as they get older, when they're just going to be inundated with that for the rest of their life, pretty much. And then I also like to hold off on grains personally. So at least until about 18 months. Obviously, with my first, I didn't do that. But with the other 2, I was pretty good about making sure that they didn't have any grains until 18 months or so, 18 months to 2 years. So no rice, no oats, no flour. And it's interesting because you feel like, oh, this is really hard, but actually it's pretty easy. I mean, if you're feeding your kid protein and vegetables, they don't need a rice or an oat or a piece of bread to go with it. Like that is good, a sufficient meal for them and nutrient dense enough to where it's not necessary to have those others options. And the reason why I do this is because there is a particular enzyme that develops when those 2-year molars come in. And so this depends with each child. The molars could come in around 18 months or later around 2 years. And once that comes in, then their body is more capable of digesting those starchy carbohydrate foods. So that's my personal opinion, and that's what I have, tried to do with my kids.
Mm-hmm. It's like they're designed to, once they get the teeth to grind that food, their gut is also equipped with the enzyme to break that food down. How fascinating is that? And keep in mind too, I think something we forget because we're conditioned as adults to put like a veggie, a starch, and a protein on the plate, right? And it's like we need bread and we need a meat and we need a green bean. But kids are getting carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, through breast milk or a raw milk formula that has lactose in it. That's a carb.
Yep.
11 grams carb per serving of milk. And then they also are, if they are eating fruit, like banana is a great easy first fruit, so high in carbohydrates. It's like the sugariest fruit you could possibly have. So it's not that we're starving our kids of carbs. It's just we're not getting our carbohydrates through grains, which is a very like anti-American like establishment, right? We like to have our potatoes, our meats, and our bread at the same table. So that's a good reminder to give us benchmarks. Assuming you're starting solids around that 6-month area, which I think we covered in the first show, either showing signs of readiness or an age that they're maturing to. How do you feel about delaying foods? Is there ever a downside if you are like, I'm not even going to worry about food until my kid turns 1? What would you say to those parents about how that might be setting them up for the future?
Yeah. So this goes back to some of the baby-led weaning studies. There've been a lot of studies done on delayed solids introduction, and delayed solids introduction is one of the root causes of picky eating. It could be one of the root causes of picky eating. And basically kids who are exposed to foods sooner, so around 6 months ish, if they're ready, kind of thing, and they are exposed to a wide variety of flavor and texture profiles, have less incidences later on in their life of picky eating and of any issues with food. And so that's just like the picky eating side of it. That's not even the nutritional aspect of it. If we're talking nutritionally, I actually think we might have covered this in the previous episode, but I can say it again. There is a window in which all of the nutrients that were passed on from mom to baby are used up. And then specifically iron is one of them. And so at around roughly 6 months, babies' nutrient needs are greater than just breast milk alone can provide. Babies growing so rapidly that they need much higher levels of iron, and mom's breast milk can no longer provide that. And so this is one of the reasons why we introduce solid foods, because it's now time to bring in those powerhouse nutritious foods and help to aid with baby's development. And then the other thing is there's a study called The First 1,000 Days, and it talks about from conception all the way to 2 years. And essentially, if there are any nutrient deficiencies that happen within those first 1,000 days, then there's going to be health consequences later on. And in some very severe cases, behavioral, emotional, cognitive consequences. So there really is, not to like freak parents out, but it really does matter those first 1,000 days nutritionally what your child is consuming, because it impacts their development, and everything else is sort of just like spirals from that.
What are some of those common nutrient deficiencies that I would say like the average parent might fall prey to?
Yeah. Iron is a big one. Zinc, iron, zinc, the minerals mostly actually. And the problem there is, well, this is just like, I feel like this is a whole other conversation. But there could be mineral imbalances, there could be mineral deficiencies, and the mineral deficiencies could have been passed on from mom. It could be that mom didn't have enough, and so because she didn't have enough, that was then passed on to baby. And specifically for things like iron and zinc, they impact picky eating because zinc leads to like reduced appetite, and zinc is your texture and sensory mineral. So if you have a child that's especially picky about texture or has sensory needs, then maybe they are deficient, or maybe there's an imbalance in zinc and some of the other minerals. Also, one of the issues with a deficiency in zinc is it basically it causes kids to the food to taste bland. So the food that they're eating doesn't taste as good, and so they don't want to eat it. And they crave more of the like starchy, crunchy snack foods, like things like that. So just, you know, and the hard part is we live in this really toxic world, and, you know, there's all sorts of things that are messing with our mineral placement in our body. I mean, you know, there's the chemicals that you put on your body for your beauty products. There is the receipts that you touch. I mean, you know, the list is so long. It's like we could just, it's insane. Not to mention, I don't know if you guys have talked about vaccines, but obviously like vaccines too.
Yeah, we have. We've covered it.
Yeah.
Okay, so zinc, I looked at Joey there because I was like, one of our kids does struggle with like low appetite. And I was like, that's interesting. So zinc, my first thing would be like, give her a zinc tablet, but that would be not a great idea, right? So what are some good zinc-rich foods that maybe aren't as obvious to someone like me?
Yeah. The number one would be oysters.
Oh, can we get her to eat an oyster?
I doubt it.
Do you think she would? What if I paid her 50 cents? I'm not above paying my kids to try new foods.
Which kid are we trying to get to eat an oyster?
I'm trying to get our middle to eat an oyster. Because Ray's solid. Ray would be like, shoot it.
Let me ask you this, Christine. If we cook that oyster, what has changed?
Does it need to be raw or cooked?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I don't know. I'm like all cooked foods, some nutritional properties will be lost. But with oysters, they have smoked oysters, and I think that's actually the easiest way to consume them. And that being said, my oldest refuses to eat smoked oysters. That's on his like absolute no list. He gags. He finds them totally disgusting, but I have found a way. You take a can of smoked oysters, mix it in with some either creme fraiche or cream cheese and mayonnaise. Add a few capers, add some lemon juice, add some parsley or chives, turn it into a smoked oyster dip. And I mean, he'll eat that for sure.
Really?
And I find the smoked oyster dip delicious. And anybody who's a little on the fence about it will most likely like it. I can't promise, you know, everybody, but and this is a great way for any fish that you think is not as appetizing. So if sardines are not delicious to you, do the exact same thing. So like instead of smoked oysters, make it with sardines, make it with anchovies, make it with, I think smoked salmon is delicious. It's just a fish dip. Dips are a very, I think, approachable way to bring in picky eaters.
Yeah. Because kids love to dip. They love it. They love a little condiment. They want to stick there. I've watched kids eat carrots and ketchup. Okay. They love their dip.
Yes.
And I think that's funny because our middle daughter, who I feel so bad for them when they're like in their 20s, they're going to be like, Mom and Dad laid all of our feeding issues out for all to hear. But she loves capers. She loves that salty essence of caper. She puts them on her pizza, funny enough. So like if I told her, it was like, oh, it's a caper dip with a little bit of something in it. I'm not going to tell her.
Smoked caper dip.
It's a smoked caper dip. Yep.
She would eat that up. Okay, so seafood, oysters, high levels of zinc. That makes sense, I feel like.
All seafood is high in zinc?
Specifically, oysters are highest. But yes, some
like
seafood
shellfish, lobster, crab.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, she'll put down lobster
she does
and
love
crab.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a little pricey.
It is.
Sure.
I'm like, I can't buy that every week.
What about scallops? I'm assuming scallops.
Ooh, I actually don't know about scallops.
Okay.
That's a great question. I would have to look that up.
I'm going to look it up because we got scallops in the freezer.
We do have scallops in the freezer.
And then, well, organ meats. So
Okay, I need to work on this. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Tell me your best ways, because I feel like you're the queen of this. Tell me your best ways to incorporate it so that your kids will actually eat it.
The ones
Okay.
that know what they're eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can
Well,
sniff it out.
Yeah, all of my kids, I'm very open with them when it comes to organ meats. And it's just, it has become a value system in our home of no, we eat the whole animal and we are going to eat these organ meats and we're going to honor this animal. And, I'm sorry if you don't like it. I'll try and prepare it the best way that I can, but you at least have to eat a little bit of it.
Mm-hmm.
So shout out to the organ meat queen, which honestly, I learned everything from her. She's the most incredible person ever when it comes to making organ meats palatable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is awfully good cooking.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much everything I learned from her. But how I do it is I've got one kid that loves liver tonics, like obsessed with them. So basically, it's a Bloody Mary.
Wow.
And you just grate some raw liver in it. And you can add Tabasco sauce. You can add lemon or lime juice. You can add pickle juice to it. I think it's really good with pickle juice in it. Like the brine, I should say, the brine of the pickle jar. You can eat it with bacon. Just pop it down the hatch. Literally tastes like a Bloody Mary without the alcohol, and way better for you, obviously. So liver tonics are really big in our home. Another way is pate. And two of my three kids love warm pate too. And I think this is just like something about the texture of it. When it's just been processed in the blender and it's like literally hot, they're obsessed with it. They could eat the entire container. And this is where I think if you make a good pate, it's delicious and you'll want it. So a good pate is going to have tons of butter or lard or even cream in it. I think if you add cream to it, it's more of a mousse technically. But so butter or lard, even bacon fat. If you can cook your liver in bacon fat and then it has all the bacon grease in it, that helps really flavor it. Also, there's specific spice profiles that help reduce the minerally taste of it. One of them in particular is allspice. So adding allspice to your pate really helps with the flavor profile of it, making it not so strong. Another way would be, speaking of, so Awfully Good Cooking has the most bomb beef liver pate recipe, which you guys know beef liver is way stronger than chicken liver.
Mm-hmm.
This recipe, my mother-in-law who does not eat organ meats could not stop eating this. She was like, this is the most delicious thing ever. It's a chocolate chili beef liver pate. Wow. And it's essentially tastes like mole. Do you know what mole is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it has a little bit of sweetener in it. It has some maple syrup in it. It has a little bit of cacao in it. It has some chili in it. So it's spicy. It's got that heat, but it also has a little bit of the sweetness. It's so good. So definitely pate. And then the other one, these are just all her recipes, honestly.
We'll link her in the show notes. Shout out to Awfully Good Cooking.
Yeah. The best recipe is a baked liver dish, and it has bacon on it with breadcrumbs. It feels very like Thanksgiving because it has a breadcrumb stuffing on it. And then you lay raw bacon strips over the top, and then you just quickly bake it. And you've got the breadcrumbs with the liver, with the bacon and the fat. And it has a little bit of broth in it. It's so juicy and it just melts in. Oh my gosh. My mouth is watering now just thinking about it. It's really good. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can feed liver to kids, but those are the ways that my kids enjoy eating it.
Christine, do you ever get into the heart? Eating
heart is super easy.
That's what I was going to say. It's I feel like liver, it's got a pretty strong irony flavor to it. It's like, man, having recipes is key. So thank God we can link these in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for myself, quite frankly. But man, zinc content, what kind of benefit variance from liver to heart is there? Is heart giving you a similar benefit or a great one? What's the comparison?
This is where my girl, Janine Farzine, would know that answer. I actually don't know the specific nutrient differences between liver and heart.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that liver's king.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. So liver has the highest of all of them.
I would view liver as like the multivitamin, and heart is just our kids will eat it and they don't even know it's
Oh, totally.
because it's like a muscle.
Yeah. Super mild.
I will say we had a recent spat, me and Joe.
Oh, no.
So he went moose hunting, right?
Yeah.
He brings home 500 plus pounds of delicious, like world's cleanest meat from Newfoundland.
Gosh.
Okay. Not a single like GMO on the island. Like it's just these moose are grazing wild blueberries and who knows, like forage that's never, there's no agriculture there. There's no like, oh, it might be sprayed. No, none of that.
That's insane. And 500 pounds. Are you kidding me?
So much meat.
That's going to last you for like 2
freezers.
years.
But then like he bring in this like, and it's all like very nice and like vacuum sealed. The processor does a great job. Then he brings home in this like bag as if you'd carry around dog poop on a walk.
Oh, please.
Bits of the tongue. And I'm
the
telling
tongue is
you,
the best part.
But listen, I wanted to throw that gray little thing away so fast because one, they didn't vacuum seal it. And I was like, I'm not going to throw this in my freezer. Two, it's gray and the tongue is so large on a moose. Like we're talking like it had to be sliced and bagged in multiple bags. Looks like a big giant silver worm. Okay. It's not appealing, but I know you love eating like braised tongue tacos, right? So like talk to me, like walk me through this because I'm really fighting with him. I'm like, I'm throwing this away or I'm giving it to like my brother-in-law's dogs because like I don't want this tongue.
So let me just speak my piece before Christine sides with
Defend
me.
yourself.
This is TIFF, okay? This is real life marriage counseling.
So harvest this animal, take it to the butcher shop, and they all the locals looked at me and because they asked me what we wanted. Right?
You didn't even bring home the heart.
I did forget the heart, and that was my fault because when I field dressed the animal, I was brokenhearted, pun intended, over that mistake. But
the heart
that was a
is
mistake.
Somewhere in the bogs of Newfoundland.
A wolf, bear, something was nourished. So anyhow, the reality is, the butcher came out to me and was like, "Oh, you want this, right?" And all the locals, they were like, "You want the tongue?
You want the moose tongue?"
And a lot of them there, that's like the first thing they eat.
What?
Because
that's why they didn't vacuum seal it. They were like, "You're just gonna go ahead and eat that."
Literally, that is exactly why it is that way.
Fascinating.
So anyhow, curious, Christine, your experience with I'm sure maybe not moose tongue, but maybe cow tongue. Maybe you've had moose tongue, but
I have not had moose tongue, and cow tongues are pretty big, so I can only imagine how much bigger a moose tongue is. So we're talking probably 4 or 5 pounds of meat.
Yeah.
That's impressive. That's really impressive. So the Native Americans, you have to think that on a bison, there's only one tongue. One, you guys. Like that is how prized this meat is. That there's only one. And the tongue has the same nutrient profile as a ribeye, only it's cheaper. Yes.
No way.
Yes. So you've got yourself one very fancy ribeye in your fridge or freezer, wherever it is right now. But anyway, okay, how can you cook it? So you need to, oh man, Joey, you're going to have to help me with the correct cooking term, but is it poach or braise?
Probably braise. If it's going to be low and slow, covered in the oven.
No. Okay. So then it is poached. So before, the tongue obviously has this like hard outer coating to it. And
the gray
that is so grossing you out. That has to be removed. And the only way to do that is to put it in a massive pot with water. You can add aromatics to it and simmer it for a tongue that big, probably like 3 to 4 hours, maybe even longer, until it's like fork tender.
Is that going to make a tongue stock?
It does. And that's a wonderful broth that you can use. You can use that to cook rice. You can use that to, I know Liz is like, just Liz, you don't even have to be in the house. Go somewhere else. Like
my pregnant self can't handle this now. Joey's going to have to do this when I'm like postpartum.
I'll tell you what, this is the same woman, just so we're clear.
Feed me tongue, aren't you? When I'm up there in the bed, you're going to be like, here's some ribeye.
This is the same woman saying these words that cooked a bunch of chicken feet in a pot to make a stock.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like chicken feet are just better than a big gray slivery tongue. I don't know. I can't with it. The way it looked in the bag, just tied in a knot.
Oh
The
my
presentation didn't do it for her.
I
Yeah,
was just so upset. I was so offended. I was
She
like,
eats
how
with her
dare
eyes.
you bring this thing into my home and I now have to stuff it in my freezers. But you're right. I'm being dramatic. I'm fully aware. But okay, so make a tongue
we're enjoying
stop.
it.
So we're gonna
Side
simmer
note.
tenderness. No, go give it to. What do you got? Side note.
Side note, since you're talking about the presentation of it, we had some neighbors that went and hunted deer and they didn't want the heart and they came back and this deer heart was so fresh. It was literally in a Ziploc bag, fresh from the previous day's hunt. It was super bloody. I have never had a heart so fresh in my life. And I can tell you it was phenomenal. Like I had never tasted heart so delicious. So there's something about those fresh organ meats. Okay. But anyway, you need to poach it for a long time. Just simmer it. I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's the right term. And until it's fork tender. And then you take it out. It'll be really, really hot. You'll have to wait a bit until it cools down. And then peel the outer layer off. It's super satisfying, but maybe don't do that around Liz. I think this whole thing should be done while she's at the spa or something. Like maybe let her go get a massage.
Agreed.
And, that kind of thing. And 5 hours later, come back home and you'll just have tongue tacos prepared for you.
Great.
So you peel the outer layer out. And then at that point, you have two options. My favorite way to eat it is slice it really thin and then fry it in butter until it's crispy. And then you add a little bit of salt to it. I actually think it tastes best that way. Or you could chop it up, like cube it, and as if it was like barbacoa or something, and add a sauce to it. And just like dress it up with a fancy sauce and then put it in tacos.
Is it dense or does it shred?
So it depends on how long you cook it for. If you cook it for a really long time, it shreds for sure. Okay. Essentially, if you overcook it, it shreds. Yeah.
Okay. I can get on board with like some shredded meat in a sauce of some kind, no taste buds on there. You know what I'm saying? Like peel that off.
You would want to shred it well, Joey. That's funny that you say that, Liz. My oldest feels that way about tongue. He'll eat it, but if he sees the little taste buds, because even when you peel off the outer layer, there's still a tiny bit of stuff that remains.
Oh my.
And he prefers not to eat it. So like he wants me to shred it. That's his favorite way to eat it. And just so you know, like flavor profile, it's not strong at all. It melts in your mouth, very like buttery and fatty. So if you like eating a ribeye,
I love ribeye.
I know, same. Then that's kind of a little bit of what this tastes like.
That's the encouragement I needed. Thank you for that.
Sounds like a great baby food, right? To braise off a
maybe we'll save
moose
for the
tongue.
baby.
You should save some. Yeah, I mean it's a massive tongue. You're not going to eat it all. Just you guys.
No, we will not.
So freeze what's already cooked and then save it for baby.
It's a great idea. My baby is going to eat some moose tongue, y'all. I mean, that's like next level nutrient.
And just like that, we're back, ladies and gentlemen. We got her.
Now I'm excited about it.
It's all about the motivation.
I want to know how you we talked about organ meats, but like what else are you bringing into the home and making accessible to your kids where maybe if you have an example of like foods they started out not liking, but then you transformed it into something that they actually love. Like talk us through behind the scenes, Christine Muldoon's kitchen. What is that looking like?
I like that question. So the prime example that I give for foods that my kids didn't like before is actually the oysters one is a big one, and mushrooms. We've already, said I love mushrooms personally. It's one of my favorite foods. And the two older have always really hated mushrooms, like a lot. And so I don't stop serving them and I don't stop putting them in their meals. So if I'm thinking like beef stroganoff, for example, beef stroganoff has mushrooms. So in that, I will leave the mushroom large so that if they want to pick it out, they can. And it doesn't bother me if they want to pick it out. I fully understand that that's just like a personal preference for them. My sister is, 30 something years old and still doesn't eat mushrooms. So like you talked about, there's just personal food preferences. And I think that we need to honor them. So, but that being said, I'm still going to expose them to these foods with the hopes that maybe one day they'll like it and maybe they won't ever like it. And that's fine, but we're just going to experiment with it and see. What are some other foods? Probably different types of veggies or.
You mentioned oysters.
Oysters.
How'd you deal with oysters?
So oysters, honestly, if you just start them out really young, it was one of the first foods for my youngest. I mean, that kid can house a can of oysters. And the older two would watch him eat it, and they would be shocked, and they would just say, like, what, how is it that he's eating this? And then eventually my middle child became intrigued and thought, well, okay, I'm going to try this. Maybe this isn't that bad. And again, I think presentation really matters. So how are you offering these foods to your kids? When it comes to a questionable food like that, where you're like, I don't know if they're going to like it, you garnish it, make sure that it's in a good dip. Maybe it has like a cracker or something to go with it, or like a special spice that you can sprinkle on top. It really matters how you present these things. So for my youngest, what eventually tipped the scale to her liking oysters was she'll eat them if they're on a cracker. So if you take an oyster, put it on a cracker, sprinkle a little salt on it, she likes them and she'll eat them. I said youngest, I meant middle. And my oldest, obviously we figured out the dip thing, the dip solution for him. So, and this goes back to the relationship aspect. This is how I am showing each of my children that I love them and I'm thinking particularly about them. So I'll make a point to say, you know what? I know you don't like oysters that way. I'm going to make your favorite dip. I'm going to make your smoked salmon dip, or I'm going to make the smoked oyster dip because I know that that's the way you like to eat it. And I was thinking about you today, and this is here for you if you want to eat it, kind of thing. Really weaving in those relational pieces so that they know that they're loved and you thought about them, and that plays out at the dinner table or whatever mealtime you're sitting down to eat. Oh my gosh, my mom specifically did not put spicy sausage in this meal for me because she knows I don't like spicy sausage. You're more likely to win them over and have a more peaceful mealtime if you are thinking about those like small little details that matter to kids and husbands.
Ooh, we didn't even talk about husbands. I love that. I was actually going to ask you, what is your approach to spicy food? Do you try to introduce it early? Do you push it? Are you trying to grow their tolerance, or is it something you don't worry about?
It's not something I worry about because I'm married to a Mexican, so spicy food is a big deal in our home. And actually as a child growing up, I hated spicy foods. Like I was so sensitive. Pepper would send me into a tizzy. I was so sensitive to spicy foods that I started telling people that I was allergic to them. Like I would just say, oh, I'm allergic to spicy foods, so I can't eat them. And it wasn't until like when I was maybe 25 that I suddenly started gaining an appreciation for them. And I was like, this isn't that bad. This doesn't taste that spicy anymore. This is actually pretty good. And now I like them. I don't have the level of tolerance that my husband or my oldest have, but I can appreciate them and they don't bother me as much anymore. But that being said, my daughter is extremely sensitive. She's just like me. If she sees a speck of pepper, she like freaks out. So I have gotten very good at the farmer's market talking to the farmers about their sausage. Like, I need to read these. Is there any black pepper? I need to read the ingredients. Is there any black pepper in this? Like, how spicy is this kind of thing? And so I respect the spiciness preference because since I grew up with it, I kind of know how that feels. And then on a different level is my husband, who won't eat eggs. He absolutely hates eggs. And same thing, I have to respect that. So he doesn't eat any breakfast foods that have eggs in them. If it's like a pancake, he'll eat it. Or if it's baked into something, he'll eat it. But he's not going to eat a quiche or a frittata or an egg muffin. And he has gotten to the point where he will drink my smoothies, which have raw egg yolks in them. But if it's something like the other day, I made a Dutch baby pancake and it was a complete flop, like total flop. He was like, "This is disgusting. I can just see the eggs in it. I'm not eating it." I was like, "Okay, fine."
Oh
Note to
my goodness
self.
gracious.
Dutch babies are very egg heavy. It's almost like a baked custard. Sometimes the consistency can feel that way.
I wanted to touch on the smoked oysters and the mushrooms
Just keep going
before we
back to
move on.
oysters.
When I
Yeah.
was little, growing up, my grandfather loved smoked oysters. It used to be like the Christmas gift I would give him.
Like a tin of oysters?
Yes.
No way.
Oh, that's sweet.
And so
That is cute.
whenever we would go out and I was little, 3, 4, 5 years old, I remember my parents like helping me buy a gift for my grandpa, and I would always buy him smoked oysters. And it just had me so interested. And so I totally was like locked in, and I started eating smoked oysters. And the way that I would eat them is I'd open the can and I would pour some red wine vinegar on them, and I'd put a little salt and pepper on them, and I would eat them with a fork right out of the can.
Wow.
And so I used to, Christmas time, eat 3 or 4 cans of, and it was like, there was definitely a season in my life where it's like the first time a kid tries beef jerky and they're like, "I'm going to eat it all." And you're like, "Don't eat it all. It's so expensive." Right. And then, you're trying to get them to eat beef jerky and they're like, "I don't want this." Right. So it's a pretty quick, conversion. But there was definitely a season in my life where I could not get enough smoked oysters. So funny. I loved them. The next thing, mushrooms. I went through a season of life where growing up, it became like a personal thing. And it's funny to hear Christine say that, where it almost felt like, man, they put mushrooms in this. They don't care about me, right? It became that. Again, this is just, victim Joey.
Yeah, that's kind of drama.
It was big drama, right? I was a dramatic child, right? Loved having the attention, I wanted to feel important. And if you know anything about my family or my parents or my dad or the Hazelmeyer side of the family, that was just like, I was never going to win that battle. So
No.
anyhow, mushrooms. I went to culinary school, right? And so learning how to cook and prepare mushrooms, chefs did not care what you didn't like to eat. That you would say like, "I don't really like mushrooms." They would kind of look at you and be like, "Okay, so here's what we're cooking today," right? I don't care if you don't like mushrooms. This is what we're cooking. And as I learned to cook mushrooms, and I kind of dropped my pride a little bit, I will say I can absolutely eat mushrooms now. So it's not like I can't eat them, but I don't crave them. So if someone's like, "What do you want on your pizza?" I'm not thinking to myself, "Man, I gotta have mushrooms." I haven't gotten to that point yet. I would kind of like to be, if I'm honest. And what I would say is that I believe in a lot of these foods, even at the age of 30, you can start to recondition yourself to like try them, but you have to try them in different forms. I cannot eat mushrooms to this day. That's not true. I don't want to eat mushrooms. I'm kind of grossed out by mushrooms that come out of a can. Like if they come out of a can, I'm like, but like that's kind of like most vegetables for me. I'm not like super excited about any vegetable that comes out of a can, much less like a slimy looking mushroom. I'm like, eh. But you get some really beautiful mushrooms from the store, and you saute them up, or you serve them in a pepper sauce or on top of a steak. I'm like, game on, right? I'll try those. I say this because my little brother was the same way about olives. And one day he looked at me and was like, "I want to like these." He ate one. He's like, "Don't like it." Next day, ate some more olives. He looked at me. He's like, "Don't like it." To this day, he's like, "Now I love olives." Right? Took him like 30, 40 times of eating it, but he's totally kind of like retrained himself to like olives. So, anyways, shout out to Kyle. He likes olives, and I'm working on mushrooms. And the only thing that I can't really eat right now, or that I'm not like in love with, is like soft cheeses. But if they smell bad, I'm just like, eh. I'm not like dying for a smelly cheese. My dad took Limburger with us to Newfoundland and like opened it up in the cab of the truck.
Who would do such a thing?
We're driving, and I'm just like,
do you know what Limburger smells like?
No.
Oh my gosh.
I'm guessing it's a really stinky cheese.
It's the most foul smelling cheese on the market. You know he did that just to prove a point, though. What is the...
No, he didn't. He didn't do that to prove a point.
He just loves the flavor.
He brought it to have while we were there at camp, because you can't buy that, I don't think, in Newfoundland. And so he wanted to bring it, which I understand that. But then when he opened the cooler that was in the truck, again, so people that don't know, we drove to Newfoundland. It took us about 32 hours of driving.
Whoa.
So when you open a cooler that smells like Limburger cheese, I don't know. It just felt like, There's something wrong with that.
Hilarious.
So, anyways, it smelled like there was like a diaper in the
Yeah,
truck.
it's a bad smell.
Anyhow.
It's a bad smell.
Tangent there. Limburger cheese. Anyone out there listening to this had Limburger? So you've never had Limburger cheese, Christine?
Is it a German thing?
I don't know.
It's got to be Limburger.
I like stinky cheeses though, so I might have had it and not known it was called Lindenburger.
Lim, Limbu.
Oh, Limburger. Okay.
Well, that's how I've always said it. I could be wrong, but
We need fact checked here.
Wait, but I wanna interject and say something about that because you talked about your brother just trying the olives every day.
He inspired me for mushrooms, so I'm on his journey.
Yeah. And there is a truth to that. There is research behind that shows that kids, and not just kids, people, we need anywhere between 15 and 20 exposures to something before we even begin to accept it. So this is really big when it comes to picky eating and feeding kids, because oftentimes we as parents will set a plate of food down in front of our kids. The kid will take a look at it or maybe even try it and say, I don't like it. And then we as the parent give up and we're like, okay, that's done. I'm not serving it again. My kid doesn't like X, Y, and Z. And just for a little bit of like a personal story, my 4-year-old currently, his most common phrase is, I don't like green stuff. So you put a plate of food in front of him, and if it has any green stuff on it, he's not going to eat it. But the funny thing is, I mean, he eats avocado and he eats olives. So it's just being a young child and expressing your opinion in that moment. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop serving green stuff. In fact, literally this week, just for fun, I was like, I'm going to serve a plate of food that's only green stuff. And I did. And the whole plate of food, all it had was green stuff on it. And he says his usual phrase. And I asked him, I was like, well, but this is chicken. Do you like chicken? Oh, yeah, I'll eat the chicken. Okay. All right. This is avocado. Will you eat the avocado? Yeah, I like avocado. Okay. This is a shishito pepper. Will you try this? And same thing. I don't know if I'm going to try that. Okay, well, you can take a bite if you want. Taste it. Let me know what you think. And then he took a bite and he was like, no, I don't like green stuff. Okay. So
that's so funny.
Just keep trying. Keep trying. That's the moral of this story. Don't give up and keep offering it in many different ways, because they might not like it if it's, let's say, roasted, but they might like it if it's in a soup, or they might like it if it's in a dip, or they might like it if it's raw, or they might, pick the food. Just find 5 to 8 different ways to offer it, and in different recipes, and just do it over and over again.
I was going to ask you, and this ties into what you just said, where you draw the line between the phrase, my kid won't eat X, and you know what? You can't walk around with 30 different food preferences, okay? 1 or 2 is fine. But if it's like, oh, you're serving that, my kid won't eat blah, or my kid doesn't eat that, or blah, blah. And I think, how many times are we as parents just reiterating, my kid won't eat that, my kid won't eat that, my kid won't eat that? I almost, when I hear that, I kind of do what you do, Christine. When I hear that if a kid comes to my house and they're like, my kid won't eat that, I'm like, you know what? I'm serving it. I'm serving it, and I'm going to get them to eat it. Not in like a mean way. But I'll tell you what,
challenge accepted.
I have a pretty good track record with serving foods that, quote, your kid won't eat, and they eat it and they're like, this is so good. And I'm like, oh, mom's not around. Now this magical world of culinary experience is open to you, because I don't take I'm not going to eat that. And I'm like, here, I'm putting it on the plate. Why don't you try it? Everyone else in my family is eating it. A little bit of peer pressure is probably working in my favor. And as long as it's not like an allergy that I'm going against or something as insane, I think a shishito pepper is probably a little intense for a 4-year-old. So I can totally see how he was like, okay, mom. But like basic things, like a meatball, or if you're like, I don't know about this tomato and this, nope, just I'm putting it on the plate. If it does take that 15 to 20 exposures, then should we just keep giving it to them and maybe drop the phrase of my kid won't eat that? Or when do we get to accept this is their food preference and I will live with it? Like, how many passes should we be giving our kids, truthfully?
Oh, yes. I love this question. Just because you talk about that phrase, my kid won't eat that. I think we have got to stop saying that
Mm.
because we're labeling our kids in a negative way. We're not even giving them a chance. And from the beginning, if we're saying, if our kids are hearing us say they're picky eaters or my kid won't eat that, they're going to internalize that, especially if they're hearing you say it over and over and over again. So, and this whole idea of, we've talked about baby-led weaning, we've talked about feeding kids. It's all a journey of learning how to eat. Heck, Joey is who knows how old and just now learning how to eat mushrooms. So like this is a long game that we're talking about. This is not a sprint. If your 4-year-old is not eating shishito peppers right now, who cares? Maybe in 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 more years they do.
Mm.
And maybe they don't, like you said, and you just have learned that that's their food preference. So like I have learned that the oysters for my oldest are not his favorite food. That's not really his preferred food preference. So am I going to make them all the time and am I going to serve them the way he doesn't like them? No, because I'm going to be respectful of the fact that he's made it pretty clear now as a 10-year-old that those are not his favorite. So the one way that we can approach that is, I think, changing our language. So instead of saying, my kid won't eat that, or my kid doesn't eat that, or my kid only eats X, Y, and Z number of foods, we can say, my kid is still learning to eat these foods, or they don't like them today, but maybe they'll like them tomorrow. And I even say these with my kids all the time, especially with the whole green stuff comment. I'm like, oh, you mean you don't like green stuff today? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Maybe tomorrow you'll like it. Or maybe if I serve it in a different way, you'll like it. And telling them, eating is a skill that we're learning how to do. And we are, all of us, learning how to eat different foods. And so part of that is looking at new foods on our plate, maybe being brave enough to try them, and just doing that over and over again. And the other piece that I thought you said was really interesting is the peer pressure piece. And this goes back to the relational aspect. Oftentimes, it's very common where kids won't eat certain foods at home, but then they go somewhere else. They go to a friend's house, or they go to a grandparent's house, or they go to an aunt or uncle's house, and suddenly they're eating that food.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because of the pressure.
Mm.
It's because at home, they feel that pressure and they are on guard and just like they can't handle it. And so, and also, there's a battle of the wills going on. There's a relationship friction that's happening. Whereas if they're at a friend's house, that mom isn't going to care if they don't eat it. I mean, most moms, they're not going to create that issue surrounding whatever particular food it is. So that's the first thing, is the pressure is removed. And then the second, like you said, is peer pressure, positive peer pressure. It works in both ways. It works for the oldest as it does for the youngest. So you can have foods that the youngest is eating that the oldest won't like, and then eventually the youngest influences the oldest, or vice versa. You can have foods that the youngest won't eat that the oldest influences, and friends and family members, and just all of sitting around at the table and having conversation and not really talking about the food and just fostering those relationships and that connection can help with trying new foods. And yeah, those are some of my thoughts about that.
I think it's so interesting. Something that you have displayed, but you haven't called out specifically, is that with your 4-year-old, you're more in a challenge posture with the foods that you're feeding. You're like, oh, you don't like green stuff? Here's a whole plate of green stuff. Let's talk about it. Versus with your older kids who are more mature and you can articulate things, and they've proven after years of you exposing them to this, you're giving them grace in that. You're like, you know what? I see you. I love you. I'm gonna feed you this particular food in a manner that is is honoring your preferences. And you're not doing that with the 4-year-old as much. I'm hearing there's a little bit of a shift in your parenting approach. You can be a little in those earlier years when we're still exposing and we're still stretching the palate. You need to have kind of that posture of challenge of like, hey, let's learn how to like these foods. And then when they reach a certain point, you're like, okay, we can move this from you're just being difficult to this is a true food preference, and that's okay because I remember having food preferences too, or I still have them today. And so understanding like where your kid is at in that kind of category, right? Is this a 6-year-old or in our case, 8-year-old who maybe needs to continue to learn new foods? Or is this your 13, 14-year-old who you're like, no, you know what? You're generally a good eater. This isn't you being picky or stubborn. This is just you expressing your feelings around food. I'm going to give you grace. You might hear those two things and like, but wait a minute, you're treating your kids differently. Good. Treat your kids differently. They deserve to be treated differently, especially around food. My goodness. So I think that's so cool that you do that with your kids. And I feel like we kind of do that, but it took us a long time to realize, no, we still need to be in a challenge, encouragement posture with our younger kids. We can't accept at age 4 that they just don't eat that. That's too young. That's cutting them off before they've really matured enough to have the right to have a food preference. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think that that's great.
I love the way you articulated that and expanded on it. And I think in addition to that, there's this idea of boundaries. And that's really, really hard in today's society because oftentimes as parents, we don't want to be the bad guys and it's hard to set limits. But when it comes to food, especially in today's food culture, we have to set limits, guys. I mean, look, there are so many dietitians out there on the internet right now that are saying all food is the same. A cookie is the same as a piece of meat, as ice cream, as candy, as vegetables. And come at me if you want, but I completely disagree with that. And I'm personally not a fan of that approach. And this is where being a strong, confident leader and setting those limits and boundaries with our kids matters. Because then as they get older, they can understand that, okay, I don't know, I'm at this birthday party or something, and I've got 3 choices. Let's just say pizza, juice, and cake. Which one is probably the better choice of those 3? Maybe the pizza, actually. And, I have the knowledge and the willpower to say, I'm going to opt for the better choice in front of me in all situations, not just birthday parties and stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that's super important we are facing an uphill battle. Okay, there's no denying that as parents. Our food culture, as you said it, is not so hot. And so I know we're fighting the same battle with you. So that's a good reminder. Anything else that we haven't covered? I feel like this has been so good so far.
I dig it.
Anything that you were hoping to share with this being the second conversation we've had that we haven't covered yet?
I know. I'm thinking, what did we not? I mean, we could talk maybe a little bit about like reversing picky eating.
Yeah, let's go there.
If people already have that as an issue.
People in this very room might have that as an issue. So I think if we can, not that we're picky particularly, but we are like I said before, we are currently trying to challenge one of our kids.
We are parents after all.
Yeah. So let's leave our audience with some encouragement. If they are facing a quote picky eater, I think you said, great, stop calling them that in front of their face.
Yeah.
But also, like, what else can we do to help support these kids?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I have sort of like 10 tips that I give. And the first sounds really basic, but it's establishing a mealtime routine. And I know we talked a lot about that in the previous episode, but I can't reiterate enough how important that is. So having consistent times and a consistent location and a consistent rhythm for meal times really matters, at least for 2 out of 3 meals. So really focusing on that. That's step one. That's like what I do first. The second would be along the same lines as that is reduce grazing and reduce snacking, because kids that are snacking all day are not going to sit down and have a full meal. So really working on providing kids with those consistent 3 meals a day, similar time, that kind of thing, and eliminating or reducing snacks as much as possible. The next would be, we talked about constant exposure over and over and over and over again. I just can't reiterate enough. And not giving up and realizing that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So you're not playing for the, when your kid is 4 or 5, you're thinking about your child up until they're like 18, 20, 21 kind of thing. So really giving yourself a little bit of grace and just being aware that at the end of the day, your relationship is really important too. But yeah, so constant exposure, just be patient with yourself and them if they don't pick up on things right away. And also refrain from, we've talked about this, but refrain from negatively labeling children. So, any phrases that are calling them out as picky eaters or, they don't like that particular food, try and rephrase it so that you are not labeling your child as something. And also reducing and eliminating as much as possible things like bribing or bribing, punishing, using food as a control method, or any behavioral tactics to control your child and quote unquote get them to eat something. So reducing that as much as possible. And hey, we're all guilty. I have done it myself. Like, it happens.
But reducing that power struggle, even when you're talking about how a kid might eat something at an aunt's house that they wouldn't eat at the parent's house because their immediate guard is just lowered because they're not across the table from a parent. I think that's an interesting thing to remember of like, well, I was laughing because I was like, I'll pay so-and-so to eat an oyster.
Oh,
that's above and beyond. I feel like, listen, girl, if you choke down a raw oyster at the age of 8, I'll give you 50 cents. But that's not like we're sitting at the dinner table, finish your oyster.
Yeah.
But
Finish your oyster.
I just, that would be insane. But I do think this is something that Joey and I struggle with, and we keep going kind of not back and forth on, but we're trying to find what works because there is an element of and we've told our kids this, hey, it's not about you finishing the food on your plate right now. It's about you learning how to do something that you don't want to do. And so there is an element of having some level of self-control if you are at an age where that's appropriate. My 4-year-old, I'm not really pushing in that way, but my 8-9-year-old, if she's like, I don't want to eat it. And I'm like, you clearly could just take one more bite and it would be over with. Then I'm sensing it's not about the food, it's about the willpower and the struggle. And that's the piece I want to get. And so I go back and forth. Is food an avenue to teach this lesson or is it not? And so I think maybe it's situational or it has to do with your kid's age or maturity or conversations you've already had about food. Because actually there's been some really good times where we've leaned into that and been like, listen, you got to get comfortable doing things that you're uncomfortable with. And taking that extra bite just to prove to me that you can is a big deal. And we watch her do it and it's like, well, that was great. I'm glad we pushed for that. And then there's been other times where we're like, man, that was a stressful dinner. We shouldn't have pushed. So that one's hard for me. I'm just going to be honest, but it's something that we regularly talk about. So I think
also
good.
Parents will know, and correct me if you don't agree with this, but there's times where your kid is being defiant to you and it has nothing to do with the food. And then there's times where you're pushing food where they truly feel full. They're not interested. They have an aversion to it. They don't like it. And you can tell, okay? If I were to go upstairs right now and try to force Ruthie to eat eggs right now, it would not be that she rejects them out of just defiance for me.
No.
It would be that she's like, Dad, I really just don't want to eat these eggs. Like, she'd be like, I'm confused. Like, why do you hate me?
That
Right?
would feel like a punishment.
It would
to
be
her.
like, it would be a strange thing. But there's also moments where we make like delicata squash, and she'll sit down like, Dad, I told you I don't like squash. And I'll just whisper back like, hey, I'd just like you to try a bite. She'll eat her dinner, and I'll say, hey, did you try a bite of the squash? And I don't expect her to finish the whole thing. She's like, no, I told you I don't like it. I'm like, hey, you're allowed to get up from your plate. When you just show me you can try it.
One bite.
You don't have to eat it.
Yeah.
You don't have to eat it. I just want you to try it. And then it becomes like a, well, I don't like it.
Battle of the
right?
wills.
Those are the scenarios where I'll say, hey, Ruth, it has nothing to do with you having to finish the food. You are well nourished. I am happy with the food you've eaten today. I'm not going to withhold treats. There's not none of that's going to happen right now. I just want to see that you're capable and have the self-control to do something that in this moment you don't really want to do. And she'll look at me sometimes and like squint, and then she'll like take a bite and look at me and say, I don't like it. And I'm like, okay.
Oh my gosh.
All right, Ruth. All right.
But there's other times where she takes that bite and she's like, oh, actually, that's
And then
pretty
she
good.
eats all of them, right? So it's funny.
Okay. Sorry, we derailed you on that like fourth or fifth point. But that's a huge one for me. Is like not because that's the culture we grew up in, is right. You sit at the table until you finish all your food. Punishment with food is very, they go hand in hand. And it's even something that we've kind of talked about in our house. So it's a good conversation to have, I feel.
I think that it's so situational. And this is where as parents, we just have to be very conscious of how we're feeling in the moment too, because, I touched on this briefly before, but how regulated are you when you sit down at that table?
Yeah.
How much emotional capacity do you have to manage somebody's eating preferences in that moment? And so that plays into it as well. And then the other thing that you said, which is really interesting, you talked about the defiance factor. And if we're talking psychologically, kids need to feel safe in order to sit down and eat. And they need to feel like they have a deep relationship with their caregivers. And oftentimes, some of the root causes of picky eating happen because there is a kind of like a break in that relationship. And in one of these, it manifests as the child feels like the parent is not in charge. And so the child dominates the parent. And this is because for whatever reason, the parent is not providing calm, confident leadership vibes. And so the child feels completely unsettled, and they have to, and that's when they become very domineering. They are, they push back a lot, and situations like that. Like these are more, severe issues. And then another aspect of that is when the child doesn't feel connected to their parent at all. And this can happen for many, many different reasons, but the parent-child relationship when it comes to food is paramount. And so really looking at that and being willing to reflect on your own personal issues or background, whatever it is. That's a really big piece to this as well. So
I love that. People don't talk about that enough.
Yeah.
You don't hear that enough.
There's a really, really good book out there called Nourished by Deborah McNamara. I can't recommend it enough. It talks all about the relational aspect of feeding kids. And, I had the privilege of talking to Deborah on our podcast. And it was an interesting conversation because she was so hyper-focused on relationship that she didn't. This is her research and her belief, but that we're too focused on ingredients and what we're feeding our kids in today's society and not enough on relationship. And I can agree with part of that, but I also think that because of today's food culture, we can't just not care about the ingredients, because we're talking about products that aren't even food. They're like food-like substances. So there's definitely a balance, if there can be, between the two of like educating about nutrient-dense foods and trying to feed our kids real whole foods as much as possible, and also focusing on the relational aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so important. I love that. Any other tips for reversing picky eating that we can leave parents
Oh,
with?
yeah. So 2 more. I would say don't be a short order cook. So this idea of, well, this child doesn't like this, and this child doesn't like this, and this child doesn't like this, so I'm not going to make that, and I'm going to tweak this and do that kind of thing. And before you know it, you end up having like 3 different dinners. So really, as the caregiver and the parent, your job is to provide the food. And you don't have time to be making 3 different meals. So you're going to make one meal, and we're all going to sit down and we're going to eat the same thing. And the more you do that consistently, it usually takes about 2 weeks or so of doing this, ideally for every single meal, at least 2 meals a day, to help reverse that picky eating. But this is huge, because if they know that they have an out, they're going to take it. And then the last one is, don't serve your kids too much food. It sounds really simple. It sounds so simple, but like the smallest step that you can take right now, today, at the next meal you are preparing for your family, is, especially the younger children, serve them a tiny amount of food. Smaller portions are not as intimidating. They don't overwhelm a child, especially a younger child, and it's much easier to have a small amount of food left over than it is to fill up a child's plate with food, and for them to look at it and be like, oh my gosh, how on earth am I supposed to eat all of this? And then say they don't want it. And, it's just harder. So you can always serve more if they end up liking it, but start with small amounts.
Those are great. Those are great tips. Things I feel like I could implement literally at dinner time.
Tonight. It's like,
literally,
it's
I'm
happening.
gonna text Christine like, hey girl, we got it. Don't you worry. No, I think that's great. And again, I think everyone on their parenting journey faces some level of picky eating at some point. So I think the conversations like this are just helpful, because you don't have to have like a chronically picky eater to glean something from this episode. I also love that we talked about the relational piece. That's definitely something that we haven't really talked about ever on this podcast. And I'm even thinking more about how we can be more intentional about that in our own home. So thank you so much, Christine, for coming on.
Yeah.
This has been such a joy. I always feel like I'm sitting down with a friend when I'm chatting with you, because you're such a wealth of knowledge, and you're so graceful in your delivery. You don't ever make me feel like I'm a bad parent because of choices I've made previously, but you encourage me to make better choices in the future, which I so appreciate. Please let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah. So honestly, like, being honest right now, homeschooling has completely taken up a lot of my time. So I am most active, and just a little bit, on Instagram currently. But that would be Nourish the Littles. And so give me a follow when I have time to create content. I do, and I put it up there. Unfortunately, my blog and website are a little abandoned at the moment. That's my capacity is limited.
Hey, that's fair.
But yeah, I would say Nourish the Littles. That's my Instagram. That's my blog as well, website. And yeah.
And you also have an awesome podcast.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
With Corey.
Thank you. Yes. So if you want to listen to more like mom related adventures, it's Modern Ancestral Mamas with Corey from For Nutrients Sake. And yeah, we just talk a lot about like parenting stuff. So.
Yeah, it's a great show. Highly recommend.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on the show and facilitating yet again an awesome conversation around feeding our kids, something I care so much about. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, I cannot wait until you have baby number 4 and you get to start solids with said baby.
I'll be excited. And it's going to eat that moose tongue for sure. You all know it.
Anyways, thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
All right, thanks.
Christine Muldoon has left the virtual chat, and I, for one, love the you don't like green foods? Get some.
Here's a whole plate
approach.
Well, I just thought that was so funny, because she had also just talked about like honoring your kids' food preferences. And that's why I wanted to call up the age difference. Like, that is so huge. I think that's something you and I have even talked about recently about how we approach different kids. You should absolutely be parenting each of your kids differently if they're in different life stages.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, that's exacerbated because our kids are so far apart. They're like 4 or 5 years apart, which is a large age gap. And so it's a little more clear to us what stage they're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can lean into that. Oh, you don't like that? Let's really talk about it. But then to do that to a 10 or 12 or 13-year-old would feel really combative if your relationship.
The approach has to adapt.
It
from
has
kid to
to
kid.
adapt.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
I love that she kind of shared that without even articulating that. And then, it made me kind of feel better about ways that we challenge our younger kids versus our older kids. I love that. So yeah, Christine's always awesome. Go check out their podcast. I've done 2 shows with them actually. Most recently, I talked about this pregnancy and birth planning. And then I did a show like about a year ago. I think I was on their pod, probably around the time she first came on ours. So we've kind of done a content swap back and forth, and her and Corey are super great, awesome follows. So go check them out.
I dig it. Friends, if you're just tuning in for the first time, there's another episode that we did with her, which is what Elizabeth was just referencing. You can go find that. If you're also just hearing us for the first time, there's some things you need to know. Some things that we have for you to help kind of support you on this real food journey. One of those things is that we have some free resources on our website. That's at homegrowneducation.org.
Mm-hmm.
Go check those out. We got real food knowledge on there for you that you can buy. That being in a raw dairy guide and in a sourdough guide. So get you in the sourdough game, how to begin fermenting your wheat products before you bake them is essentially another way to say that, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Took a swing. Hope for,
Swing and a hit.
We got it. Look at that. Raw dairy, get you in the game with raw dairy. We're big believers in raw milk over here. And go check those resources out. We also got some paid resources on that site as well to help get your kids in the game, learning about real food, educating them about where their food comes from. We have the Real Food Framework that recently dropped. This is to help shape your understanding of your real food journey, no matter where you are on that journey today, whether you're a beginner or an expert. This can kind of keep you moving.
I had a message come in this week, literally like yesterday, that was like, I'm making this mandatory reading for any of my children before they get married. I was like, heck yes.
Turn up.
It's like that adult, that like teenage resource. I didn't write it particularly as a curriculum, but for them to be like, this is what we're going to use to help launch these kids into the world. I was like, I feel so honored to be a part of that journey. Thank you so much. I love how the framework is serving families in a new way that our meal plans hadn't done yet. And so I think that's super cool. Kind of rounded out the collection.
Hop on our website, check those resources out, homegrowneducation.org. We also have a retail company where we sell goods, things for your kitchen, for your home, for your shower. I don't know.
Huge announcement, by the way, on that.
Shoptheh.com. Give them the announcement.
We have subscriptions. Subscriptions are live. That means you can have a coffee subscription. So if you don't have to be like me and Joe and run out of coffee and then not place your order in time for the weekly roasting, forget all that. Okay. Get on a subscription. You can do a soap subscription because we're using dish soap every day. Hopefully. I hope you're washing your dishes daily. If you're not, let's chat. Okay. You can get on a soap. Is there body care subscription?
There is.
Literally, the things that the consumables that
Towel
you
cream.
don't want to run out of, your soap, your body care, your coffee, your tea, get on a subscription. Okay. It's advantageous for you because it's like, I don't have to think about that and I don't have to run out of it. And then you'll be really sad when you have to go to the store and buy that liquid soap and you realize I used to wash dishes like a peasant.
Totally.
And it's
lard dish soap with a horsehair brush is washing dishes like a king. Let's be clear.
Even though really it's so old school.
It's just the best.
It is the royalty of dish care.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Get in the game. Get yourself some lard dish soap.
Here's a benefit
Get
to
on
the
the subscription.
I wash my cast irons when they're piping hot. I think about this every time I scrub the cast iron.
Oh, they don't melt.
I could never use a plastic
that's a good
dish brush.
point.
It would melt. It would turn into that little stiff brush.
Yep.
The horsehair is like, turn up. It's
That's
just,
true.
it doesn't matter. It's steaming. Now, I would never recommend doing that with a non-stick pan. Obviously, you're not supposed to wash those pans hot, but I don't cook with non-stick anyway. So throw out your non-stick pan, throw it away. My cast iron, I like to wash hot because things come up easier.
Yeah, a little looser.
So yeah, the horsehair is heat resistant. And my goodness, what an added benefit.
That's so
Also,
true.
it's plastic free.
Yeah, it's so good. Shoptheh.com is where all those goods can be found. Definitely encouraging you to get on there. And the coffee and tea that Elizabeth mentioned, it is a premium level coffee and tea. This is for like the coffee aficionados. Okay. So if you've had amazing, incredible coffee, this is not, we're not trying to come out here and compete with like Dunkin' or Starbucks. This is a totally different market. So if you like those coffees, and not to sound like weird, like stick with those coffees. Like if you're like, man, I love me some Dunkin' coffee.
We'll also have some conversations, but if you want to level up,
we're different than that.
Join the coffee snobs. we are tea snobs as well.
There you go. So
join
shoptheh.com. You can follow us on Instagram if you do that sort of thing. I'm at Joey Hazelmeyer. Elizabeth is at Liz Hazelmeyer. We're at Homegrown_education. We have a Substack where we create original content that is separate from this podcast. This podcast that you're listening to right now will always be free to listen to. The Substack is not. It's paid. It helps support this podcast and keep it going. You can go, if you want to lend a supporting hand to us, keep us rolling. You can jump on. It's $8 a month.
Or like $6 if you pay for the whole year. We just, before this recording, recorded a whole Substack show. And that's content you will never hear unless you're part of that community.
Substack.com/homegrown education to find that content. You can also find it linked in this episode. You can find it in our Homegrown Education Instagram bio. Instagram message us if you can't find it. We'll hook you up with the Substack.
I'll send you the link.
Go check those out. Until next time, friends, that's a wrap.